He was my father's son until my brother spoke 3 words. 6 months later, I'm still trying to understand why. My father looked me in the eye and said, "You're no longer my son." This is what happened next. This is my story. It was supposed to be a celebration, not an execution. That much became clear the moment I walked into the house and saw the stiff set of my father's jaw and the way my mother avoided my eyes as I stepped through the door. My arms full of groceries I hadn't needed to bring but had anyway because I always brought something when I came home, because I wanted to be thought of as thoughtful, as reliable, as the son who still cared even after working 12-hour days designing high-rises. I was told we're impressive but never quite good enough, and tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was the night I was finally going to tell them about the promotion they'd just gotten at work, the one that came with a corner office and a corner of respect I'd been chasing for years. But the smile froze on my face the second my father looked up from his chair at the head of the dining table and said, "We need to talk," and my brother Rohan, sitting beside him with that annoyingly calm expression he always wore when he knew something I didn't, just sipped his tea like he hadn't spent the last 10 years trying to outshine me in every possible way. And before I could even put the bags down my father said the words that turned my blood to ice, "Arjun, you're no longer a part of the business," and I laughed because surely he was joking, surely this was some sort of test. But the laughter died in my throat when he said it again, colder this time, more final, and when I asked why, all he said was, "You've changed, you're not the boy I raised," and Rohan didn't look up, didn't say a word, but the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth told me everything I needed to know, and I felt the floor drop out from under me, slowly, deliberately, as if the years of being the good son meant nothing at all. I stood there for a moment too long, the plastic bags hanging limply from my hands, groceries spilling onto the floor as the words my father had just thrown at me echoed in my skull like a hammer against glass. "You're no longer a part of the business," and then, as if that wasn't enough, as if tearing away the one thing I had worked for my entire adult life wasn't sufficient punishment, he stood up, slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he's about to deliver a sentence, not a sentence of jail time but something worse, something that would haunt me forever, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, loud enough for everyone in the house to hear, "You're no longer my son," and the words hit me like a physical force, knocking the wind out of me, and I swear I felt my knees buckle even though I didn't fall, and Rohan's eyes met mine for a split second and there was something in them, something dark and satisfied and smug, and I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to shake my father and make him look at me and remember who I was, who I had been, the son who had stayed up all night helping him with accounts, who had managed the site visits when he was too tired, who had sacrificed his own dreams to keep this family business afloat, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, as my mother quietly excused herself and disappeared into the kitchen, and Rohan stood up, smoothed his shirt, and said, "I'll handle the paperwork," and just like that, I was dismissed. He'd asked, cast out of the only home I had ever known, and I walked out of that house that night with nothing but my car keys and the clothes on my back, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know who I was without their approval. The drive back to the city was a blur of red lights and blurred streetlights and the bitter taste of disbelief coating the back of my throat, and I kept replaying my father's words over and over again in my head like a broken record. "You're no longer my son," and each time it hit me harder, like a fresh wound being reopened, and I couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of how everything I had done, all the sacrifices, all the loyalty, had been so easily discarded with a single sentence. And when I finally reached my apartment, I threw my keys onto the counter and stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the city outside, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had nowhere to go, no one to call, because for years my entire identity had been wrapped up in being Bikram Malhotra's son, in being the reliable one, the capable one, the one who would always do the right thing, and now that had been stripped away, and I was just, me, Arjun, the discarded son, the failure, the disappointment, and I sank onto the couch and stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to breathe. And somewhere in the back of my mind I could still hear my father's voice, cold and final, and my brother's silence, which had somehow spoken louder than any words ever could, and I wondered if they had always seen me this way, if I had just been too blind to notice, or if I had truly become someone they no longer recognized, someone they no longer wanted. Over the next few days I tried calling my father, just once, hoping maybe he'd pick up, maybe they'd hear the desperation in my voice and remember that I was still his son no matter what he had said. But the phone just rang and rang until it went to voicemail, and eventually it went straight to a message saying the number was unavailable, and I tried my mother next, and she answered on the third ring, her voice trembling like she had been waiting for me to call but didn't know what to say, and when I asked her what had happened, why my father had done this, all she said was, "He's just upset," and I could hear Rohan's voice in the background telling her to hang up, and she said she had to go, and that was it, that was all the contact I got. And Rohan blocked me on WhatsApp the next day, and then Instagram, and then even LinkedIn, like he was trying to erase me from existence completely, and I sat alone in my tiny apartment staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and I couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't do anything except think about the life I had lost and the family that had cast me out like I was nothing, and I started questioning everything, every memory, every interaction, every word I had ever said to them, wondering if there had been signs I had missed, if I had been too proud, too stubborn, too focused on my career to see the cracks forming in the foundation of my relationship with them. And the worst part wasn't the rejection, it was the silence, the complete and utter absence of any explanation, as if my entire existence had been erased without a trace. Time passed in a haze of sleepless nights and empty coffee cups, and I tried to throw myself into work, but even that felt hollow now, like I was just going through the motions, pretending to be the man I used to be while the real me sat in the corner of the room watching silently, judging, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. And then one evening I got a call from Mira, my oldest friend from college, and she sounded hesitant, like she didn't know how I would react, and when she finally said what she had come to say, my heart stopped for a second, because she told me she had seen Rohan at a party a few weeks back, drunk and loud and careless, and he had been talking about me, about how he had planted the seed in our father's mind that I was becoming arrogant and ungrateful, that I didn't respect the family legacy anymore, and I felt like someone had punched me in the gut, because if that was true, if Rohan had actually manipulated my father into turning against me, then none of this had been an accident, none of it had been about who I had become, it had all been orchestrated, calculated, and I sat there in silence staring at the wall, my hands shaking, trying to process the fact that my own brother had done this to me, not out of jealousy, but out of some twisted need to be the favorite, the perfect son, the one who would never be questioned. And I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp and dangerous, but I forced myself to stay calm. To think, to plan, because if Rohan had played dirty, then I would need to be smarter, not angrier, if I ever wanted to get my life, and my family, back. He started writing everything down, every interaction I could remember, every conversation, every family dinner, every time Rohan had been in the room when something went wrong or when I had said something my father didn't like. And I realized pretty quickly that Rohan had always been there, always whispering, always guiding, always steering my father's opinions in subtle ways that were almost impossible to prove. And I found an old group chat from years ago where Rohan had casually mentioned how I was getting too big for my boots and how maybe it was time someone reminded him where he came from, and there was no malice in the words, not overtly, but the tone was there, the underlying message clear. And I felt sick to my stomach, because it wasn't just one incident, it was a pattern, a slow and steady erosion of my father's trust, and I realized that Rohan wasn't just my brother, he was a master manipulator, the kind who never left fingerprints but always managed to get exactly what he wanted. And I knew I needed help, so I called Advocate Sharma, an old family friend who had always been fair, and he listened patiently as I laid it all out, and when I was finished he said the one thing I didn't want to hear, right now, your father's under his influence. Anything you say could backfire. Play the long game. So I did. I focused on building a life outside of them, a life where my worth wasn't tied to their approval, and slowly, painfully, I began to heal. The silent war had begun, though neither side would call it that, and I found myself walking a tightrope between anger and acceptance, between wanting revenge and wanting reconciliation. And every time I saw a family friend or ran into a distant relative who asked why I wasn't speaking to my father, I just smiled and said it was a family matter, which was the easiest lie I could tell without having to explain the truth. And I threw myself into my new job, not because I loved it, but because it gave me structure, and I started taking night classes in design theory, because I needed to feel like I was still growing, still moving forward, and I volunteered at a local community center, helping kids with their homework, because it gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in months. And slowly, I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece, brick by brick, not as Vikram Malhotra's son, but as Arjun, the man I had always been underneath the expectations and the pressure and the constant need to prove myself. And it wasn't easy, and there were nights when I cried myself to sleep clutching the old family photo my mother had slipped me during one of her secret visits, but I survived, and in surviving, I began to discover a strength I didn't know I had, a quiet resilience that didn't need anyone else's approval to exist, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to become the person I was always meant to be. It was a rainy Tuesday when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up, and on the other end was my mother, her voice barely above a whisper, and she said she needed to meet me, that it was important, and I met her at a small cafe near the old bookstore we used to go to when I was a kid, and she looked tired, older than I remembered, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands shaking as she stirred her tea, and she told me she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that she had tried to talk to my father, but he wouldn't listen, that he had believed Rohan because he wanted to, because it was easier to blame me than to admit he had been wrong. And I felt a lump rise in my throat as she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, and inside was a letter, yellowed with age, and when I opened it I saw my own handwriting, the messy scrawl of an 18-year-old boy full of dreams and promises, and the letter was addressed to my father, and in it I had written about how I wanted to make him proud, how I wanted to take care of the family, how I would never let him down, and my mother said, he kept this all these years. He never threw it away. And in that moment, I saw the cracks in my father's armor, the pain behind his anger, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't stopped loving me, he had just stopped believing in me, and that was a difference I thought I could work with. Months passed in a blur of small victories and quiet defeats, and I heard through mutual contacts that Rohan had been promoted again, this time to a senior management role in the family business, and people were calling him the golden boy, the one who had stepped up when I had failed, and I felt a pang of anger, but I pushed it down, because I knew the truth, and the truth was that Rohan's success was built on lies, on manipulation, on the carefully constructed image of perfection that he had sold to my father. And then one night at a family wedding I got a call from a cousin I barely knew, who told me he had seen Rohan bragging about how he had orchestrated my downfall, how he had known Arjun would crumble, and the cousin had recorded part of it on his phone, and when I watched the clip later that night, sitting alone in my apartment, I felt a surge of anger so strong it made my hands shake, but I didn't act, didn't call anyone, didn't confront anyone, because I knew that what I needed wasn't revenge, it was proof, and now I had it, and I tucked the video safely into a folder on my laptop, labeled evidence, and I smiled for the first time in months, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I knew that eventually, the truth would come out, and when it did, they wouldn't see it coming. I decided to write a letter, not to accuse, not to demand, but to reach out, to bridge the impossible gap that had formed between us, and I poured my heart into it, every word carefully chosen, every sentence a mixture of pain and hope. And I didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't ask to be taken back, didn't even ask for an explanation, I simply asked for one thing, a conversation, just one, where I could look my father in the eye and hear the truth, whatever it was, and I gave the letter to Ma Mother and told her to give it to him when he was ready, and I waited, day after day, week after week, and there was no response, no word, no sign that he had even read it, and I started to lose hope, to think that maybe he never would. That maybe the man I had once called father was gone forever, replaced by someone who had believed the lies and turned his back on his own blood, and I tried to move on, to focus on my new job and my new life, but every night I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had read it, if he had cared, if he had even remembered who I was. 6 months came and went in a haze of routine and quiet longing, and I had a new job offer by then, smaller than the last but more meaningful, and I had made new friends, rebuilt some old connections, and found a sense of peace in the little things, like walking in the park on Sundays or cooking dinner for myself without feeling guilty about wasting food. And then one evening, as I was unpacking a box of old things I hadn't touched since the fallout, I found a small package slipped under my door, and when I opened it my breath caught in my throat because inside was my father's old watch, the one he had given me on my 18th birthday, the one I had always worn on important days, and there was no note, no explanation, just the watch, and I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the meaning behind it, and I didn't know if it was guilt or regret or just a simple gesture, but I cried anyway, because it was the first time in 6 months I had felt anything resembling connection, and I slipped the watch onto my wrist and sat there in silence, wondering if this was the beginning of something, or just a goodbye in disguise. My mother called again a week later, and this time her voice was firmer, more resolute, and she told me that my father wasn't doing well, not physically, but emotionally, that he hadn't been the same since I left, that he sat in his study for hours staring at old photos and rarely spoke, and she didn't mention Rohan, but I knew what she meant, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with anger, because I had tried, I had reached out, and they had ignored me, and now that my father was suffering, they wanted me back, and I didn't know if I could forgive them, if I even wanted to, but I also knew I couldn't ignore the fact that somewhere deep down, a part of me still missed them, still wanted to believe that they cared, and I told my mother I would think about it, and I hung up the phone and sat on my bed staring at the ceiling, my father's watch ticking softly on my wrist, and I thought about all the years we had shared, the quiet moments and the loud arguments, the birthdays and the failures and the small victories that used to feel like mountains, and I thought about the man he used to be before Rohan had slithered his way into his confidence, before the lies had taken root and twisted everything we had built, and I didn't know if I was ready to go back, if I could sit across from him and not feel the sting of his rejection, but I also knew that if I didn't try, I might always wonder what could have been, and so I told my mother I would come, but not yet, not until I was ready, not until I could face them without falling apart, and she didn't argue, just said she would tell him, and that was enough, for now. When I finally walked through the gates of the house, it felt like stepping into a memory that no longer belonged to me, the same garden, the same porch, the same smell of old wood and polished furniture, but everything felt different, quieter, heavier, and my heart was pounding in my chest as I climbed the steps and rang the bell, and when the door opened and I saw my father standing there, older, frail, his shoulders slumped like they had given up on carrying the weight of the world, I felt something crack inside me, and he looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, and then he said, quietly, "You came," and I nodded, unable to speak, and we sat together in the living room, the same one where he had told me I was no longer his son, and for the first time in months, we were just two men, father and son, with nothing but silence between us, and eventually I told him I had received his watch, And he looked down at his hands and said, I kept your letter too. I read it every day. And in that moment, something shifted, something fragile and raw and real, and I realized that he hadn't stopped loving me, he had just stopped believing he deserved to keep me, and I didn't say anything, just reached out and placed my hand over his, and for the first time in a long time, we both just sat there, holding on. Rohan showed up the next day, unannounced, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying himself like he still owned the place, and the moment he walked into the room and saw me sitting across from my father, his expression faltered for just a second before he masked it with a fake smile and said, well, I see the prodigal son has returned, and I could feel my father tense beside me, the lines on his face deepening, and I stood up, slowly, and looked at Rohan, really looked at him, and said, you lied to him, and Rohan laughed, but it was hollow, forced, and he said, I only said what needed to be said, and I told him I had proof, that I had recordings, messages, witnesses, and his smile faded completely, and my father finally spoke, his voice tired but firm, and he said, enough, Rohan. eBay heard enough lies. And in that moment, the man I had once idolized stood up, not as a businessman or a patriarch, but as a father who had finally opened his eyes, and Rohan stormed out, slamming the door behind him, and I sat back down and looked at my father, and he said, I'm sorry, and those two words were enough to break something open inside me, and I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I loved him, and because sometimes love means choosing to see the good even when it's buried under years of pain. Life didn't magically go back to normal after that, and it never would, but something had shifted, something had been repaired, slowly, carefully, like a fractured bone being set back into place. And my father didn't ask me to come back to the business, and I didn't ask to return, because we both knew that what we had lost couldn't be regained overnight, but he started calling me more often, just to talk. And sometimes my mother would join, and we would laugh about old memories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of the family again, not because of obligation, but because of choice, and Rohan left the business not long after, citing personal reasons, and though I knew the truth, I never said anything, because some battles hadn't they worth fighting, and because I had already won the one that mattered most, the one where I reclaimed my self-worth without destroying theirs, and one evening, as I was visiting, I went upstairs to my old room and found an envelope on the desk, and when I opened it, there was a letter inside, written in my father's handwriting, and it said, we made mistakes. But I see you. Always have. And I sat on the edge of the bed and held that letter to my chest and cried, not because I was hurt, but because I was finally free, and because I was home. Sometimes, the real victory is not letting yourself lose, even if the other person wins with a lie. If you've ever felt something like this, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Don't forget to share it with someone close to you, they might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more such real stories, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.